If you're building websites using the Divi theme, you might be looking for new ways to lay out your content, something outside of the standard row structure. Using CSS grids gives you a new, different way to arrange the modules within Divi. In this video, I'll be showing you how to implement CSS grid system in Divi step by step. Hi, my name is Ania, and my goal here is to help you build beautiful websites. Recently, I shared 3 different Divi layouts, all made with CSS grids, and CSS grid model is a pretty complex system with many different properties and ways to use it. So in this tutorial, I would like to show you what I think is the easiest way to get started, the simplest way to implement CSS grid within the Divi Builder to fully control the grid layout and structure of your page. Okay, so let me show you the sample grids I've created for Divi Lover subscribers. The first layout is very simple, but it wouldn't be possible to achieve that using the Divi Builder alone. We have this overlapping elements here that overlap different rows, and it works great on mobile because we can decide where each element goes on smaller screen sizes. The second grid is a bit simpler. We could do something like that within the builder, but it would be difficult to keep the same height to make sure everything is perfectly aligned together, and also control where each element goes on smaller screen sizes, right? So, and the third grid is a bit more complex. We have more elements here, but we also see this overlapping rows. And again, on smaller screen sizes, we can choose which module goes where, basically, and make sure our layout looks beautiful on mobiles as well. Now, looking at that layout from within the builder, we can see the final version right here. But if I switch to wireframe view, you'll see that this layout uses a single column row. So each module is placed below another, and we're using CSS to make sure it displays in that way on desktop, and then we modify that for tablets. And on phones, I disabled the grid with CSS. So step number 1 is to define your structure as you would like to see it on mobile. Okay, so for mobile view, we would want to see an image and then call to action, image, call to action, and so on. For example, it could be a different module, a different content structure, but how you add your modules here you should think mobile first. How do you want them to appear on your phone? You don't need to do that, but it's just easier. As I mentioned earlier, I want to show you the easiest way to create that grid. So using a standard layout for phones, make it that easier because you don't need to specify separate CSS media query for your phone to align these elements. So step number 1, creating the structure. And here I have a new page opened, and I want to insert a new full width row. And now I will be using 3 images and 3 call to action modules. And as I said, it would work with any type of module really, but for images I recommend using a divider module instead of the image module, because when you're using image as a background, it will fill the entire container. Okay, so I will add a background image here, and I have some sample image right there, and we can choose to hide the divider here. We don't need to show that line. Okay, so we only need the background to fill the container, and the container size is based on the height of the divider. So in the sizing height, let's make it 100% for desktop and tablet, it will fill the grid area. And for phones, we can use any value really. I would usually stick with a pixel value, like 250 pixels. And one other thing I would do here is to remove any margin from any side really. Okay, so that's our divider, our first image. So image number 1, okay? Now I will duplicate this and change the image. Now, if I would like to link that image to a separate page, for example, we could use the link property here. And now the other type of module I would like to use within my grid is a call to action module. So let's see, sample, title, sample button. And for the button to be visible, we need to specify the URL. Okay, so that's a good start. Now let me maybe change the background color and add a label. So call to action number 1. And now I will also duplicate that module. And here, let's change the labels. And let's make sure that this is in the order I would like to see it on mobile. Okay, so on mobile I want to see an image, then call to action, image, the second call to action, and the third at the bottom. So on mobile, that is how it would look. And I can see that my call to action is using some margin at the bottom. So here again, in the spacing margin, I would want to make sure that there's no unwanted margin here. So now let me extend that margin to all call to actions throughout this page. So remove the margin from other two as well. Okay, so step number 1, create your structure. That's done, right? Now, step number 2 is define the grid area names. Okay, CSS Grid includes a property called grid area, and one way to do it is in the advanced section. In the custom CSS main element, we could specify grid area and then give it a name like area 1 or image 1. But instead of using defining custom CSS for each element, I like to do it in one place in my custom CSS, and here I would only assign a CSS class. So image 1, for example, that would be my grid area name, would be the same. So image 1 is my CSS class, and now in the page settings custom CSS, I am targeting that class, so image 1. And obviously you might want to be a bit more specific when choosing a name for your content, but for the purpose of this walkthrough, image 1, just to keep things simple. And now again, grid area image 1. And I can duplicate that and define grid areas for image number 2 and 3. Change the name of the grid area property, and now define call to action CTA1 grid area CTA1 and duplicate that for number 2 and 3. Okay, so this is a CSS that defines a grid area names for 6 different CSS classes. Now I want to apply these CSS classes to my modules as well. Let's save that. And now call to action CSS class CTA1 image number 2, image 2, call to action 2, CTA 2, image 3, and call to action 3. Okay, so we've defined the grid area names for our grid, but on its own, that CSS property doesn't do anything, okay? But if we target the parent container and apply display grid to it, we can control a grid template using these names. Now, the important thing to understand is that CSS Grid needs to target the parent container. And if we want to display each module in a separate grid tile, we have to target the column as the container for our grid. So in the row settings, inside the column settings, I will add a CSS class to that column, DL grid. Okay? And now that is step number 3, we have to define the main structure for our grid container. So back in the page settings CSS, we can target our DL grid and simply define display grid. That's the first property. Now we need to choose the number of columns. So we just need to specify the grid template columns property. And we can use a special unit, a unit that is designed to work within the grid. It's called FR, a fraction of available space, basically. 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR gives our content 3 columns, okay? We could use repeat function, but to keep it simple, that's all you need to know. If you want 4 columns, you would just simply add additional 1 FR. Now, you don't need to worry about that unexpected token 1 FR. It is a correct CSS unit, so don't worry. And now my favorite part about defining the CSS grid using the grid area names. If we look here and imagine this is a first row with 3 columns. We have a first image here in the first column, then the second image, and then a call to action, the first call to action. In the second row, we have the first image again, a call to action, and the third image. And in the last row, we have third call to action in the first column and in the second, and the last column is our third image. And all we need to do is use that within our CSS. So the property we are going to use is called grid template areas. And inside quotes, we would define the names of each area inside each row. So first image 1, image 2, call to action 1, and then another set of quotes for the second row, image 1 again, call to action 2, image 3. And last row, call to action 3, and image 3 in the last column. Let's save that. We could change the background here so that it looks a bit nicer. Let's try with this color. Okay, so the height of the grid would be controlled by the height of the content of these modules in here. So if we would add some spacing at the top and bottom of our call to action, let's say 50 or maybe 80 pixels, something like that, and extend that padding to all call to actions throughout that page, Depending on the content inside, you could use different values, but it's as easy as that, okay? So now if I save that, I want to show you another property we can use within the grid. So in the custom CSS, we have that grid template areas, and we can also define a grid gap 10 pixels. Simple as that. I love that property. 20 pixels maybe. Maybe that would match the rest of your website content, right? So let's stick with 10 pixels for now. And that is basically it. Now we can modify that grid for smaller screen sizes. Now, if we preview that on the front end, as I resize the browser window, you'll see that this doesn't work well on smaller screen sizes because it still uses that same grid. It tries to use it on smaller screen sizes as well. So for tablets, and that is a media query for the screen size at maximum width of 980 pixels. So media max width 980 pixels. Like that. Here we would change our grid to different value. So our DL grid would no longer use 3 columns. It still displays grid, so we don't need to repeat it ourselves, but grid template columns would only have 2 columns, and then grid template areas, we would image 1, call to action 1, then call to action 2, and image 2. And in the last row, we would have image 3 and call to action 3 on the right side. You see how easy it is to arrange your modules just using their names within the grid template areas property. The grid gap could stay the same. Let's save that. And let's see how that looks now. So for tablets, we have this awesome alternating images on each side. And then for phones, which is 767 pixels, we could go back to single column layout just by specifying the display block back on the DL grid selector. So for screen sizes below 767, DL grid can use display block. So it is no longer displayed as a grid. The container, our column, would go basically back to normal. So if I save that now, here, refresh the page, and on mobiles we would have a standard layout. So you'll notice that for the layouts I've created here, I've changed that a little bit, so the media breakpoint is a bit different, and I'm adding a bottom margin between the modules on mobile so it fits the grid gap, but these are just details. All you need to know to work with the grid within Divi is basically these two properties, the grid template columns, grid template areas, and that's it. You should be able to use any type of module, or even use your rows as the content of each grid item, and then your section would be the container for the grid, but that would be a bit more advanced and complex. But using each module as a separate grid element, you can do that easily using that method. And that's it. I hope this walkthrough was helpful. Please do let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I invite you to try it yourself now, recreate the same exact version, or use this method to define your own grid, something that matches the content you're working with. I would love to see what you came up with, so don't be shy and share your work with us. And remember, you can download the Divi layouts, the JSON file with the 3 sample layouts to get you started. You'll find a link to that resource right here where you watch this video, and I will also include it in the comments below. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.